Russia and the President of the United States speaking on such an important issue, that's bad news for Europe, and that's bad news for Ukraine. Because the United States is going to agree to most, if not all, of Russia's conditions. Because it's a game we started. We got Ukraine to agree to play the game, and then we got Europe to buy into the rules of the game. I don't think that this is going to be the last negotiation, but I think this is the most important negotiation. Everything else was a setup for this. The Ukrainians have committed to a process. Europe has bought into the process. Russia agrees to the process. We have a tennis match. And now Russia is sending the ball back, but the player isn't Ukraine. Now the Russians are saying reality-based, because that's the other thing that the Trump administration kept talking about, whether it's Pete Hegseth or whether it was J.D. Vance, whether it's Marco Rubio, whether it's the president himself. We have to be dealing with the situation as it exists on the ground, the reality of it. And Russia is about to set forth. He is so far removed from reality, it's not even funny. So he's finished. It's the end of Zelensky. And when Zelensky goes, you're going to see a collapse of Ukraine, political will, social will. And all Russia has to do, keep the game playing until Ukraine gets into a position where they will comply with Russia's demands. And Europe will have no choice but to follow along. This is the game that's being played. It's called diplomacy. It's a master class being put on by the Russians, and I believe with the assistance of the United States. First of all, let's understand the following. Zelensky, the United States humiliated him in Washington, D.C., and then he was in Riyadh meeting with the Crown Prince, but he wasn't allowed to be the head of the delegation. And right now, inside in Kiev, you hear talk now that he's out. He's done. And my guess is that he'll be out of there within 2 weeks. I don't know where he physically is right now. I don't know if he's on the sidelines of the G7 meeting. I don't know if he returned to Kiev, but he can't last long in Kiev. He's been discredited as a leader, humiliated as a leader, and he has once again directly contradicted the United States after a meeting where his negotiating team received information from Marco Rubio about territorial concessions, that this isn't going back to 2014 or 2022. It's dealing with the reality that exists today. And the Ukrainian delegation went, yeah, we understand that. Zelensky came out and said, no, 2014. We get everything back. We get all of Novorossiya, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and we get Crimea. That's the only term. And I think that once Trump and Putin nail down the basics, they'll bring in a closer who'll come in and close the deal. And that's going to happen in a matter of weeks. I think the Ukrainian government collapses. Now you have the conditions to where Russia can come in and participate in a post-conflict election that gets their man installed, gets a parliament, a Rada installed that's willing to make the constitutional changes that Russia views, who will agree to demilitarization on the terms set forth by Russia. And Europe will have no choice but to comply with this. This is what happened in Riyadh. Europe was trapped into a position where a ceasefire is now the primary policy objective, as opposed to humbling Russia, defeating Russia, all the things they were talking about. That's not being talked about now. They're talking about the necessity of a ceasefire. This is the game. We're moving towards a ceasefire, the conditions that need to be met to make a ceasefire possible. Who's not in Moscow right now from the United States? Marco Rubio. Why isn't the Secretary of State, who has been involved in these negotiations, not present for the most important negotiation? Because he's always been a figurehead. There's somebody else pulling the strings, somebody else calling the shots. And Rubio isn't needed for this. In fact, he's a distraction from this because Rubio has tainted himself with the Ukrainian brush and the European brush. So he's over there now playing with Europe. What happened to the last person who was supposed to be the one leading the efforts and they got sidelined and sent to Europe? His name was Keith Kellogg. You do know that he was fired. He's no longer the special envoy. I'm not saying that Rubio is going to be fired. I'm going to say that Rubio is not going to be a major part of the Russian negotiation going forward. This is now in Donald Trump's hands. Steve Witkoff, although they said he's not going to be the principal negotiator, Steve Witkoff is the facilitator. And he's got this in Trump's hands. Europe was talking about humbling Russia on the battlefield, that there could be no ceasefire, that this war could only end with a Russian military defeat, and Europe was going to be the one to ensure that defeat occurred. That was the European posture. What the United States did is trap Europe. That's what happened in Riyadh. It's not about trapping the Russians. Everybody, oh, look, we outflanked the Russians. You never outflanked the Russians. How do you outflank somebody named Sergei Lavrov that's been around forever? who's been doing this forever. Vladimir Putin, who's been the leader of Russia for a quarter of a century. These Russians are better prepared. They know more. They know about themselves. They know about the world. They know about everybody. This is not their first rodeo. This is not their fifth rodeo. This is not their 1,000th rodeo. They invented the rodeo. Then Marco Rubio comes out with Mike Waltz, and they talk about, we've agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. When there are certain conditions that the Ukrainians laid out, but it's a 30-day ceasefire, and the ball is in Russia's court. Those are very important words. Why? Because immediately out of every capital in Europe came a following statement, almost word for word. We love the idea of a ceasefire. Wait a minute. Didn't you just say that there can't be a ceasefire? Russia must be humbled militarily, defeated. But now Europe's saying, we love a ceasefire. It's the greatest thing. And the ball is now in Russia's court. They said it. Everybody said the same thing over and over again, which means that this was scripted. Never forget that. Ukraine is a sideshow, what Trump wants to do with China. Not military. We talked about this before. I don't believe that Trump's looking for a war with China. I think Trump's looking for an equitable solution to the tensions that exist between China and the United States. It's a whole different negotiating posture and step, and I don't want to bring it up here, except to point out that you can't do that if you're tangled up in a war in Europe. And left to their own devices, the Europeans apparently were willing to have a war with Russia. That would be problematic for the United States, because now Europe is committed to not war, but a ceasefire. Europe has said that is the best outcome. That is the outcome we want, a ceasefire. Listen to what Vladimir Putin said. Ceasefire is essential. We accept a ceasefire. We accept it. They're playing the game. Now, here's the interesting thing about the conditions. They didn't send the ball back into the Ukrainian court because they don't give a damn about the Ukrainians. They didn't send it back into the European court because Europe, frankly speaking, took themselves out of the game the moment they said, we accept the ceasefire. They went to the American court. It's the second time or the third time they've heard this. Nothing new is being presented to the Americans. Nothing new. And they will make sure that point's driven home when, as Putin said, maybe there needs to be a phone call between us. And the war in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is just a proxy. That's like it, the defining thing. When you have the Secretary of State articulate this, saying this is between us and Russia, we're the warring parties, Ukraine is a proxy. The United States started this war. The United States is the one who set the objectives of this war, which we know are the strategic defeat of Russia. And Ukraine is simply the proxy. This is fundamental. So because when you say that, you now understand the role that Ukraine plays. They're not driving this ship. They're just the proxy. This ship is being driven by the United States. Ironically, it's not just that this is a Kremlin talking point. I remember when I was put on the Mirtwor's death list and put on the Center for Countering Disinformation's hit list, one of the reasons why they said is that I was saying that the war is a proxy conflict between NATO and Ukraine. The timing of this, because about a week and a half later, the Ukrainian defense minister came out and said, oh, no, this is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and we're happy to be that. Give us more weapons, and we will serve as your proxy. Guys, this has been known from day one. Only idiots and the mainstream media, I guess they're the same, have been articulating something different. So again, we have to understand all this when we try and put context into the statement that Marco Rubio used to initiate everything that you're premising this show on. But there's something else that happened too, because who visited the White House prior to Zelensky's humiliation? Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer. And they visited the White House. They tried to articulate Europe's vision of what's going on, which wasn't, by the way, a vision predicated on a ceasefire, but a vision predicated on continuing this conflict until Russia was defeated. And they met to talk about 800 billion euros worth of infusion of defense funding, getting boots on the ground. The French were talking about getting their nuclear deterrence deployed into Germany, putting air cover over Ukraine, war. And now you're Donald Trump saying, I want to bring this war to an end. If I only negotiate with the Russians without bringing in Ukraine, then we have a problem with Europe, because the strategic objective for Donald Trump here is peace and stability in Europe, so the United States can disentangle itself from the European web and reallocate diplomatic, economic, and military resources to the Pacific to deal with the principal issue of China. Again, let's just make things very clear. Europe was dead set against a ceasefire. The European posture was, we must humble Russia. Russia must be defeated so that Russia knows it can never stand up to Europe again. That's what they said. I'm not making it up. And so now we have foundational understanding of this conflict. So what is the role of Ukraine? It's an insignificant role. And we saw the way that Donald Trump treated Zelensky in the White House. Dismissive. It was an ambush. Time to demean him. And there's a reason for this. What happened in Riyadh? We know Zelensky was in Riyadh. We all saw the photographs of him meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. But the president of Ukraine, why wasn't he heading up the Ukrainian delegation? Why was the presidential advisor heading it up? Because the United States said Zelensky's not welcome at the table. Don't bother. We don't want you there. You're not part of the solution. You are the problem. You just don't meet with the Russian president, just like you just don't meet with the American president. When you meet with heads of state of this caliber, there has to be a reason. His time is valuable. Why is he going to allocate time to Steve Witkoff to talk about Mark Fogel? Nope. It's because he wants to take advantage of Witkoff's access to Trump to receive a message and to send a message. And whatever conversation they had resonated greatly. Witkoff went back. The very next day, Trump has a 90-minute phone call with with Vladimir Putin. I bring this up again because if you're acting as if what we're hearing from Putin today is the first time he's considered Donald Trump's position, you're wrong. You're fundamentally wrong. He heard Donald Trump's position back on February 12th when they had a 90-minute phone call where they exchanged ideas. This phone call didn't just happen out of the blue. It was they were both ready for it. They both knew what they wanted to say. They said it. They listened. And then it was followed up by a meeting in Riyadh between the Secretary of State and his counterpart, the foreign minister of Russia. It wasn't just them. Michael Waltz, the national security advisor, met with his counterpart, Mr. Ushakov, and Kirill Dmitriev was there too. He was Steve Witkoff. You had three levels of connectivity there. Very detailed exchange of ideas, rather than simply Ukraine. I bring this up because what we're seeing here is theater. That's it. This is theater. And it wasn't just a meeting between Witkoff and Putin. Putin brought in somebody else, a name that nobody, unless you've been following Russia intimately, like me, nobody knew before this happened. How many people can honestly say that they knew who Kirill Dmitriev was? When they heard that name, most people went to Google and said, who the hell is Kirill Dmitriev? And why is he meeting with Steve Witkoff? What's the importance? Why is the head of Russia's sovereign investment fund meeting with the emissary of Donald Trump? Because they speak the language of international business, and because Dmitriev was setting Witkoff straight on the reality of the Russian economy, the false expectations that Trump had about certain policy directions that could put pressure on Russia. You need to set the record straight, what can be achieved and what can't be achieved, and to talk about the potential of the economic benefits of a renewed economic relationship. This is broader than just Ukraine. In fact, the conversation appeared to discuss almost everything but Ukraine. Marco Rubio, when he met with the Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh earlier this week, wasn't making a final deal. Rubio knew he wasn't making a final deal. What Rubio was doing was beginning a process, but it was a process that was hampered by several things. One, by the Ukrainians themselves. Up until we're refusing to. How can you talk about a negotiated settlement with Russia when the Constitution of Ukraine prohibits negotiation? This seems to be one of those stumbling blocks. These are fundamental things, guys. Previously, they've been dismissed as Kremlin talking points, but they're not. They're statements of fact-based reality. 2, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Just not going to happen. Boom. 3, there won't be European peacekeeping forces deployed to Ukraine. Isn't going to happen. Boom. And we can go on and on. This is the reality that was set forth. And how do you proceed when, no matter what the president of the United States said, because let's just reiterate what Trump has said is some of the foundational understandings that have been reached between the United States and Russia. A, Russia didn't start this war. There goes the entire European narrative that this is a war of Russian aggression. Russia didn't start this war. Russia was right to defend its interests. The British have been deeply involved in advising the Ukrainian government on various aspects of their resistance to Russia. The British are behind almost every major effort undertaken by Ukraine, whether it's the attack on the Kerch Bridge, whether it's the Kursk incursion, whether it was the Belgorod incursion before that, whether it was the 2023 summer counteroffensive, whether it was the fall 2022 offensive in Kharkov and elsewhere. The British were behind this. And Russia's shrugged it off. There will be a response, but it's not going to be the dramatic 12 Oreshniks obliterating Kiev's destroying the Ukrainian government. Why would Russia destroy the Ukrainian government right now? We're on the verge of taking control of the Ukrainian government. You got to think strategically here. It makes no sense to have the psychotic pleasure of revenge when you're winning across the board. Russia's not losing in any aspect of this conflict right now. So there's no doubt in my mind that the British advised Ukraine to carry out this attack to achieve certain psychological impact, to try and get Russia to overreact, to disrupt Russia's ability to respond in a cohesive, coherent manner to the diplomatic challenges that would accrue with the Riyadh meeting. Yeah, the British were behind this, but the British, they've got nothing. I mean, that's it. That was their Sunday punch. That was it. There's nothing else they can do. Ukraine is not at war with Russia. They haven't declared war against Russia. So this conflict should be limited to the special military operations zone of operations. Ukraine made a decision to invade Kursk, which is not part of the new Russia. It's part of ancient Russia. It's sacred territory, by the way. 1943, the major tank battles. This is, the symbolism of this is as evident to all. But they don't get the benefit of the doubt. These aren't military soldiers carrying out military orders. They have invaded Russia in violation of Russian law. There is no declaration of war, which makes them terrorists by definition, and Russia will treat them as such. So that's what's happening. Kursk was a major blow to Russia. That was a humiliation to Russia, an embarrassment. And Putin has made it a point that he will resolve the Kursk situation in favor of Russia. And so he is the commander-in-chief. And as the commander-in-chief at this critical moment in the Kursk fighting, he's went to visit his field commanders. And he wore a camouflage uniform to make a point that he is a war leader, leading a nation at war, even though they call it a special military operation, and that he takes this job very seriously. And it's a reminder to the Russian people, because that's whom he was signaling, that they need to stay on track. Don't get distracted by calls for ceasefire and things of that nature. We were invaded and we have a job to do and we need to finish this job. And he was very tough on how he sees this job being finished. He said that the prosecution's office had been ordered to prepare prosecutions of every single Ukrainian that traveled or foreign mercenary. He said they have no rights under the Geneva Convention. I think it was important for Putin to wear this uniform to remind the Russian people that they are still in a conflict. This conflict has existential proportions attached to it, and that the conflict isn't going to end overnight, that there will be more sacrifices that need to be made before victory can be achieved. But the Russian people can go to bed at night safe in the certainty of a Russian victory. And that's why Putin wore camouflage. The Russians aren't in the business of sending signals to the West. They don't care about the West. They really don't. They'll negotiate, but when Russia speaks to the West, they speak bluntly, they speak plainly. There's no need for signals. There's no need to disguise things. This is a narrative that began back during the campaign when President Trump, then candidate Trump, was given horrible advice by his principal advisor on Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. Horrible advice. And that advice turned into policy formulations that were unrealistic, both in terms of timelines and expectations. Expectations about how Russia would respond and what America could do to bring to the table. But a reality check came in the form of Russia just refusing to even engage. Russia wouldn't pick up the phone, wouldn't talk. And the reason why is that they rejected Keith Kellogg's formulations out of hand. This led to Steve Witkoff, who is normally the Middle East envoy, being sent to Russia on February 11th. Why? Why would Witkoff be sent there? Because Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi crown prince, who was very knowledgeable of the Russians, has worked with the Russians intensively. Russia is, after all, a member of the OPEC Plus. So they have constant discussions about not just energy security, but when you're talking energy security, you're talking regional stability. I think sometimes people forget that there is direct connectivity, that you can't have energy security. And if you're an energy producing nation like Saudi Arabia, and your economy is dependent upon the price of oil. And so Saudi Arabia is very interested in stability. And they watched Steve Witkoff come in and seize the reins of authority away from the Biden administration when it came to the Gaza conflict. Watch how Steve Witkoff behaved and with the Israelis and with others, and was deeply impressed and understood that Steve Witkoff's authority came not from his knowledge of the Middle East, he has none, but his ability to be the vector for Donald Trump, to channel Donald Trump. He was very close with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump trusted him implicitly. And you make budgets based upon the price of oil. What you need is consistency and stability. And regional conflict brings the exact opposite, makes it impossible to balance a budget, makes it impossible to have any predictable outcomes. And so Mohammed bin Salman called Vladimir Putin and said, this is the guy that you need to talk to. This is the guy that can get it started. Unfortunately, we saw that Keith Kellogg's pronouncements were embraced by the Secretary of Treasury designate, Scott Bessent, who has become the Secretary of Treasury, who has made ridiculous comments about pressure that can be put on Russia economically, comments that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, bought into and repeated, and still in some ways continues to articulate that this is his thinking. We have to stop pretending that this narrative began in Riyadh earlier this week with a dialogue between the United States and Ukraine. And that somehow what came out of that dialogue was new and innovative and earth-shattering, and that Russia is receiving this for the first time, and that for the first time Russia is going back to the United States with its response. This is absurd in the extreme. When you have the President of Russia and the President of the United States speaking on such an important issue, that's bad news for Europe, and that's bad news for Ukraine. Because the United States is going to agree to most, if not all, of Russia's conditions. Because it's a game we started. We got Ukraine to agree to play the game, and then we got Europe to buy into the rules of the game. I don't think that this is going to be the last negotiation, but I think this is the most important negotiation. Everything else was a setup for this. The Ukrainians have committed to a process. Europe has bought into the process. Russia agrees to the process. We have a tennis match. And now Russia is sending the ball back, but the player isn't Ukraine. Now the Russians are saying reality-based, because that's the other thing that the Trump administration kept talking about, whether it's Pete Hegseth or whether it was J.D. Vance, whether it's Marco Rubio, whether it's the president himself. We have to be dealing with the situation as it exists on the ground, the reality of it. And Russia is about to set forth. He is so far removed from reality, it's not even funny. So he's finished. It's the end of Zelensky. And when Zelensky goes, you're going to see a collapse of Ukraine, political will, social will. And all Russia has to do, keep the game playing until Ukraine gets into a position where they will comply with Russia's demands. And Europe will have no choice but to follow along. This is the game that's being played. It's called diplomacy. It's a master class being put on by the Russians, and I believe with the assistance of the United States. First of all, let's understand the following. Zelensky, the United States humiliated him in Washington, D.C., and then he was in Riyadh meeting with the Crown Prince, but he wasn't allowed to be the head of the delegation. And right now, inside in Kiev, you hear talk now that he's out. He's done. And my guess is that he'll be out of there within 2 weeks. I don't know where he physically is right now. I don't know if he's on the sidelines of the G7 meeting. I don't know if he returned to Kiev, but he can't last long in Kiev. He's been discredited as a leader, humiliated as a leader. And he has once again directly contradicted the United States after a meeting where his negotiating team received information from Marco Rubio about territorial concessions, that this isn't going back to 2014 or 2022. It's dealing with the reality that exists today. And the Ukrainian delegation went, yeah, we understand that. Zelensky came out and said, no, 2014. We get everything back. We get all of Novorossiya, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and we get Crimea. That's the only term. And I think that once Trump and Putin nail down the basics, they'll bring in a closer who'll come in and close the deal. And that's going to happen in a matter of weeks. I think the Ukrainian government collapses. Now you have the conditions to where Russia can come in and participate in a post-conflict election that gets their man installed, gets a parliament, a Rada installed that's willing to make the constitutional changes that Russia views, who will agree to demilitarization on the terms set forth by Russia. And Europe will have no choice but to comply with this. This is what happened in Riyadh. Europe was trapped into a position where a ceasefire is now the primary policy objective, as opposed to humbling Russia, defeating Russia, all the things they were talking about. That's not being talked about now. They're talking about the necessity of a ceasefire. This is the game. We're moving towards a ceasefire, the conditions that need to be met to make a ceasefire possible. Who's not in Moscow right now from the United States? Marco Rubio. Why isn't the Secretary of State, who has been involved in these negotiations, not present for the most important negotiation? Because he's always been a figurehead. There's somebody else pulling the strings, somebody else calling the shots. And Rubio isn't needed for this. In fact, he's a distraction from this because Rubio has tainted himself with the Ukrainian brush and the European brush. So he's over there now playing with Europe. What happened to the last person who was supposed to be the one leading the efforts and they got sidelined and sent to Europe? His name was Keith Kellogg. You do know that he was fired. He's no longer the special envoy. I'm not saying that Rubio is going to be fired. I'm going to say that Rubio is not going to be a major part of the Russian negotiation going forward. This is now in Donald Trump's hands. Steve Witkoff, although they said he's not going to be the principal negotiator, Steve Witkoff is the facilitator. And he's got this in Trump's hands. Your troops are confined to barracks. You stop doing bayonet training. Hell, you stop doing any meaningful training at all. Your tanks stay in because you're not going to fight large-scale tank warfare. There's no reason to bring 54 tanks out on the Grafenberg battlefield to work on getting battalions to cooperate with battalions. You may bring out 14 tanks to work with an infantry battalion in a peacekeeping scenario that was replicated, that you saw play out in Yugoslavia. But that's it. That's not high-intensity conflict. You worry more about medical evacuation than you do about closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower maneuver. You lose your focus, you lose your edge, and that's where NATO is today. Europe, NATO, was constructed with the Cold War in mind. All of the infrastructure for NATO goes back to justifications that were created during the Cold War to justify large standing armies ready on a moment's notice to respond to a Soviet incursion, to go from 0 to 60 in a blink of an eye, 24/7, every day of the year. Then the Cold War ended and the justification for that went away. So what did they do? They stopped maintaining their armies. Their armies aren't ready to fight at a moment's notice. They took them to the garrison. There was no more training for high-intensity land warfare because that was supposed to be a thing of the past. But they maintained this infrastructure, this architecture. But instead of being cutting edge, ready to fight a war, it became a sinecure. You went to NATO for a career, and you got involved in the logistics groups, and you got involved in think tanks, and you got involved in conceptualizing a new role for NATO in the world. Today, you're doing everything but preparing to fight a war. So when you have a president on that trajectory meeting, that's the American president, meeting a Ukrainian president on his trajectory, and you bring them together, this is the inevitable outcome. Ukraine and the United States are on two fundamentally opposed trajectories. Ukraine is on a path towards committing some sort of national suicide on behalf of a Europe that is rediscovering its warmongering past. And the United States is a superpower, fully aware of the role that we have played in promoting conflict in the world these past decades, and finally having a president willing to identify the root causes of this urge for conflict-based hegemony and is actively seeking to deconstruct it. But Zelensky is more than just the failure of an individual. He's the failure of a nation, the nation of Ukraine, which is an artificial nation. So that's the other thing we have to recognize. The flaw isn't just Zelensky. The flaw is the national construct, the flaw that is Europe. Europe is a fundamentally diseased continent. Its history proves this over and over again. Napoleonic Wars,
What do you think that was? World War One, World War Two, the Balkan conflict, the war in Ukraine. It's part of the same diseased culture of Europe that cannot tolerate peace. Europe is a continent incapable of tolerating peace. Europe must have war. And because America was largely derived from European roots, we inherited that mindset. And we have tragically, over the course of many decades, been a nation at war with the world because the only way to promote American hegemony was to do it through the tool of conflict. So this war means more to you than any other conflict out there right now. And so we have a president who says he wants to bring an end to this. I'd like to believe the world should be trying to give him a chance. And so this isn't a perfect president. America is not a perfect nation, and our policies are not perfect. But what I ask people to do when we speak of Ukraine is to become singularly focused on Ukraine for the moment. You have never witnessed a moment like that. The fact is, Ukraine is a symptom. It's not the disease. It's a symptom of the larger problem of how America interfaces with the world. Because we have a tendency, all of us, all observers have a tendency to become singularly focused on the drama playing out in front of us. And what we saw playing out live on TV was the most dramatic thing we've seen in the world of diplomacy ever.
This is a Western construct that buys into a narrative that says that Putin's seeking to destroy Europe, destroy NATO, and occupy Europe, to make NATO weak, to make Europe weak. When the conflict started, NATO wasn't on the table. It was about NATO expansion, but it wasn't about the existence of NATO, the future of NATO. The Russians did in their draft treaty talk about NATO withdrawing its military aspects of it down to the pre-1997 line. But that was a negotiating position, not a demand, and it's never been included in any of the prerequisites set by Russia regarding bringing a ceasefire and a termination of conflict. But Russia hasn't articulated this at all. It's not part of the Russian negotiating posture. Even in the December 2021 documents, Russia didn't make demands on NATO other than to pull the military capacity back to 1997 lines, but they didn't talk about the dismantling of NATO, the end of NATO, the termination of NATO. No, Russia acknowledges that NATO exists and that it's a reality that Russia has to deal with. But there is no linkage whatsoever between the conflict resolution in Ukraine and the future of NATO. I don't think this is going to be as complicated or as hard as people think it's going to be. It's actually very simple. The Russians have put forward some very basic reality-based conditions. When Zelensky is removed from power in the next week or two, the new Ukrainian government will be better positioned to acknowledge not only the legitimacy of the Russian argument, but to act in a manner which the Russian terms in a treaty format that's binding on all parties. That's just the direction I see this happening, because Ukraine is not going to survive much longer on the battlefield. The collapse of the Kursk salient is just the first of many collapses that will take place. Vladimir Putin alluded to it. He said, we are ready to surround major units in eastern Ukraine. No to NATO. How much more detail do you need than that? Because whatever happens has to fall back on no to NATO. So you've already started defining the four corners of whatever the agreement is going to be. No to NATO. No peacekeepers on the ground. No NATO peacekeepers. How much more detail do you need than that? Niet means niet. We can go on and on. And I think that's the direction we're heading. I think we're going to see the final agreement come in the form of a very thick, not that thick, but a substantial treaty-like document, because there are, in addition to security guarantees, there are things happening that have to survive in perpetuity. And that one of those is the Russians are insisting that NATO, Europe, the United States recognize the four territories of Novorossiya as being part of Russia, that this isn't going to become a Cold War type scenario where every map made in the United States and Europe had the Baltic nations in different colors and calling them occupied Latvia, occupied Lithuania, occupied Estonia. The Russians don't want future maps to say occupied Crimea and occupied Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Russia wants these territories to be recognized by Ukraine and Europe as being constitutionally and legally part of Russia. Britain's role in Odessa is related to its desire to make Ukraine better positioned to defend itself against Russia by carrying out selective offensive strike operations using drones in the air and sea, using guided missiles, the Scalp, the Storm Shadow, against Crimea, the Kerch Bridge, etc. The British have led a charge in this direction, and the UK has already agreed. Their prime minister has agreed that a ceasefire is in the strategic interest of everybody. So that's the strategic direction that they've committed to, is achieving a ceasefire. A key aspect of a ceasefire agreement will be removing NATO from Ukrainian soil. And this can only be done at the insistence of the Ukrainian government. And since the Zelensky government has invited them in there and doesn't want to see them go, the implication is, in order to get Britain to decouple from Odessa and that region, there will have to be a treaty in writing that commits to that outcome. All this has to be worked out. See, Russia didn't say no to a ceasefire. They simply volleyed the ball back and redefined the game. And left to their own devices, if this war doesn't grind to an end, you're going to see Russia put action to match those words. The goal here would be to get a lasting ceasefire and a permanent peace agreed to without Russia having to head down that path. Because once you commit to a fight, we see the difficulty in Kursk. Throughout the concept of a ceasefire in the closing moments of a battle, that if you don't finish the job, you might as well not have fought the battle. Russia needs to finish the job before they can get into some sort of negotiated settlement. I think we're going to see pressure being put on Ukraine to accept Russia's terms in the next week or so. And that's what Putin's saying. And the longer you wait on the east, the more you're going to get similar conditions set up there. Let's say the Russians surround the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Azov movement's great successor to the defenders of Mariupol. They have them surrounded. Are they going to agree to a ceasefire that says, and you got to let them go? You got to unsurround them.